We left off with the ghost of Christmas future, and Scrooge has now seen his grave. If there's any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried but in vain to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children at their play.
I'm so happy to be here reading to the children. So enjoy yourselves, and if you get tired, go to sleep. All right. At length, the long-expected knock on the door was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression on it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarded for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed to answer. Is it good, she said, or bad to help him? Bad, he answered. Are we quite ruined? No, there is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, her husband said. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but for the first time, the emotion was from her heart. What the half-drunken woman told me last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know. But before that time, we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor as his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, soften as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were higher, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected with a death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and children seated around the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work down on the table and put her hand up to her face. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. "The color? Oh, poor Tiny Tim." "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. Must be near his time." "Past, really," said Peter, shutting his book. "But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these few last evenings, Mother." They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a ready, cheerful voice that only faltered once, "I have known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulders, and very fast indeed." "And so have I," said Peter, "often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. "So had all." "But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work. "And his father loved him so that it was no trouble. And there your father is at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who could help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, so that they could say, "Don't mind it, Father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all his family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would have done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today, then?" Robert, his wife, said. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it was. But you'll miss seeing it often. I promised him that I would walk there on Sundays." "My little child," said Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been further apart, perhaps then, than they were. He left the room, went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set down close to the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in the chair, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face, and he was reconciled to what had happened and went down again, quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, said Bob, inquired as to what happened to distress him. On which said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman I ever heard, I told him, "I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit," he said, "and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know." "Knew what, my dear?" "Well, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Everyone knows that," said Peter. "Very well observed, my boy," called Bob. "I hope they do. Heartily sorry," he said, "for the good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray come to see me." "Now, it wasn't," cried Bob, "for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as he had known our Tiny Tim and felt for me." "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "You'd be surer of it, my dear," returned Bob, "if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. "Only hear that, Peter," said Mrs. Cratchit. And then cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "Get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob. "One of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and wherever we will part from one another, I am sure none of us will forget Tiny Tim. Shall we? Or this first parting is there was among us?" "Never, father," cried all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim is doing it." "No, never, father," they all cried again. "I am very happy," said little Bob. "I am very happy." Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, and 2 young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, the childish essence was from God. "Spectre admit," said Scrooge. "Something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom I saw lying dead." The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, through a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these latter visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of business men, but showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. "This court," said Scrooge, "through which we hurry now is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I see be in days to come." The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. "The home is yonder," Scrooge explains. "Why do you point away?" The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. His office was still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again and was wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look around before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with depleted appetite, and a worthy place. A spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded now. He saw new meaning in its solemn shape. "Before I draw nearer to that stone which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only?" Still the ghost pointed downwards to the grave by which it stood. "Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it, if thus with you what you show me." The spirit remained immovable as ever. Scrooge kept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone in the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. And I, that man who lay upon the bed, he cried, upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. No, spirit. Oh, no, no. The spirit was still there. Spirit, he cried, tightly clutching at its robe. Hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been, but for this intercourse. Why show me this? If I am past all hope? For the first time, the hand appeared to shake. Good spirit, he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it. Your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. The kind hand trembled. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on the stone. In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding his hand up in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an altercation in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrank, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost.